Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the Spartans and who they were. Okay, a lot of you have heard the phrase "Molon Lave," and basically means "come and take it," and a very popular phrase in the gun community. Which basically dares, you know, anybody that would infringe on our gun rights to come and, actually come to us and risk life and limb to take our gun rights away. Okay, so that's the spirit behind the phrase, and where it originates from is during the Persian Wars. The Persians told King Leonidas of the Spartans to surrender his arms to them, and he told them "Molon Lave," which basically meant "come and take them." So he's basically daring them to come and take them. Okay, so that's usually as much as most people know. Prior to that movie that came out, the 300, most people knew absolutely nothing about the Spartans. That movie kind of put them on the map, but it did leave out a lot of interesting things. Okay, one of the things that the movie did bring out is that the Spartans were great warriors, and in fact they were great warriors. From the time that they were, children, the boys were bred basically, and trained to be great warriors. Okay, it was a warrior society. All right. Now, one of the things that's not usually covered is why they became a warrior society, and to me that's extremely interesting. To some people, this might be a little distasteful, but to me, it's history, it's facts. It's just interesting to analyze how society is developed. Okay, so sometime around 800 BC, there was a slave revolt in Sparta. Okay, because basically, at that time, both throughout all the world, basically almost all worlds were slave societies. Okay, and the difference between who was free and who was a slave was a question of who won or lost the last war. Okay, and that's all there was to it. It had nothing to do with race, had nothing to do with skin color. It had nothing to do with with all these things that we associate with slavery today. It was simply a matter of if you go to war and you are victorious, you take slaves. If basically you lose the war or you are conquered, you become a slave, and that's all there was to it. So basically, the Spartans, which were in the southern part of Greece, had, through a series of wars, conquered the surrounding, the surrounding people, and they had made them slaves. And sometime around 800 BC, there was a slave revolt, and basically they were almost defeated during that slave revolt. So at that point, the Spartans made a conscious decision that they did not want to risk losing such a slave revolt again, in the future, because to do so would mean that they would probably become slaves to their previous slaves. Okay, because that's how it goes. You lose the war, you become a slave. So in order to prevent this, the Spartans decided that they were going to dedicate themselves to a military lifestyle. Okay, now. One of the things to be aware of is that all this information that we have on the Spartans, that dates to the 5th century BC and going back, comes to us from Herodotus. And the interesting thing about Herodotus is, first of all, he wasn't there himself. What he had done is he had interviewed veterans of those wars. Okay. And the other interesting thing that Herodotus tells us is that, there's a lot of interesting things that he tells us, but some of the interesting things that stand out to me is that in many cases he tells us that he's heard several stories, and he's going to tell us the most believable one. Okay, so he kind of, he kind of accepts that there might be a little stretching of the truth, but not as far as the Spartan military lifestyle, because that one was verified from a lot of different sources, and people actually saw that in battle. But a lot of these some of the details as far as actual stories. He tells us that he's telling us the most, what he considers to be the most believable. Okay? So that's one of the interesting things. When you're studying ancient history. And many times, the person that's telling us that history, is not at that time and place, and he's basically kind of a reporter who's not on, who's often removed from the location, sometimes physically by distance, but also sometimes time-wise, because sometimes he's reporting to us, several generations later. Okay? So one of the interesting things that Herodotus tells us is that the other Greeks considered the Spartans to be strange. Okay, they were basically, even though they were Greeks, they were different. They had this closed society, and that's part of the reasons why we have so little information about the Spartans other than what Herodotus tells us, because up until the Peloponnesian Wars, which happened a generation later, okay, because first you had the Persian Wars, where basically the Spartans and the Athenians and a few other Greek city-states are fighting the Persians, and then what happened was a couple of generations later, the Greeks, the Spartans and the Athenians are fighting each other, and that's the Peloponnesian War. And what happens is the Spartans emerged victorious out of that. And what happened was, as a result of that victory, the Spartans were no longer kind of confined to their area in the Peloponnesus, in the southern part of Sparta. Now all of a sudden, Sparta became more of an international sort of player. And what happened is, their culture started changing. Okay, and we don't have too much details. But certainly by the time that Alexander comes around, Alexander the Great, they're a different type of military force, and certainly by the time that the Romans are on the scene, they're also a different type of military force. Okay, and there's a different culture involved. They still have that Spartan heritage, but they do go through changes, and and that's why the focus of what I'm talking about here is the 5th century BC, specifically the time between the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian Wars, where you have that where basically Sparta was at its height as one of the greatest military powers, or greatest military armies to ever exist. Certainly on a man per man basis. Maybe they didn't have the numbers, but they certainly had the fighting ability and the strategical ability. Okay, but that's one of the things I just wanted to kind of put out there, because a lot of times, like I said, we hear this phrase Molon Lave. We know it relates to the Spartans. We know it relates somehow to a defiance and an unwillingness to disarm, but we don't know where it came from, where it originated from, and I thought I should share that with you guys. Now it just so happens that I'm also of Spartan descent, so that it gives me a little bit more incentive to want to share that information with you guys as far as what the background was. But the most important factor to me out of all this is why they became a military state. It was basically, they became a military state because they were a slave society, and they were aware that it's very easy to flip from being the master to becoming the slave. Okay, and that's a concept that was very, very basically it was something that they were very well aware of, and that's something that in today's society we've kind of lost track of. We don't realize that we're basically one global disaster away from a return to slavery. Okay, if you had a global disaster, be it an asteroid or a super volcano or a super tsunami or anything that would cause a worldwide food shortage, okay, would result in an economic breakdown. And I don't mean economic breakdown money-wise. I'm talking economic breakdown in terms of the absolute essentials of living, and that's food and energy. Okay, because basically, especially in the part of the world where we have cold winters, we can't survive, unless we have a way to heat our, to keep ourselves warm during the winter. So basically, one of the things I always bring out to people is don't look at past slave societies, be it the slave society that that we had here in the United States, or slave societies that we had throughout the world, because basically human history is basically 5,000 years of human slavery, and at any given time, at least 1/3 of the population was a slave, and at other times you had 95% of the population being slaves. Especially if you consider that serfdom in Europe was basically a form of slavery, where people were tied to the land and you could pretty much use them and abuse them any way you wanted to. Okay, so the important factor here is that we are one global disaster away from a return to slavery, and ultimately, who is a free man and who is a slave is a question of who wins or loses, the fight. And that's one of the reasons why I always recommend to people, make sure that you're armed and trained, because if you can picture a global disaster type of situation, once you get through that initial die-off, okay, because you're going to have a huge die-off where somewhere between 70 and maybe even 90% of the population is going to basically initially freeze to death if this happens during the winter, and then they're going to starve to death, okay, because basically the supermarket barely has 3 days food supply, and unless you're in a position to move the food around the country from the countryside into the cities, unless you have the fuel availability, basically you're going to have mass starvation. So after that initial die-off, where you have somewhere between 70 and 90% of the population dying off from freezing and starving, you will then I believe you'd have a situation where as society, as things kind of settle down, you're going to have people who are armed and you're going to have people who are not armed. Okay. And ultimately, the people that are armed are going to want to control the people that are not armed and use those unarmed people for labor. I mean, I'm not saying that that's right. I'm just saying that is that is what people have done historically. Okay, so I use history as guidance to the way people are and how they actually act, it's a mistake for us to think that we are somehow evolved or we've changed from the way that we were, several centuries or millennia ago. I'll prove, and I can prove it to people. During Roman times, Romans were amused by going into the Colosseum and seeing and watching people get executed and eaten by wild beasts and that sort of stuff, and they were amused by this. Okay. And nowadays we look at that and we say, oh my God, those were terrible people. We're nothing like that. We would never take delight in in people being killed. But how many of you watch horror movies or even action movies where people get killed? Now you're going to tell me that it's just a movie. Nobody actually gets killed. But here's the thing: while you are watching that movie, in your mind you believe that person is actually dying or getting killed, okay? And if you didn't, the movie would not have any value, all right? Unless the director is able to convince you that this person is actually dying or being killed, or you would not enjoy the movie. You would not appreciate it. So for that moment in time when you're watching it, you're actually back in the Roman Colosseum. Okay, you are of the same mindset that the Romans had when they were watching people get killed. Okay, and actually being entertained by it. Okay, so don't think for one second that you are different than those Romans. People are the same now as they were 2,000-3,000 years ago. Thanks for watching. If you got any comments, please post them. I'll talk to you guys next time.